It's that time again. It's good vibes time. I'm Martin Falls, and we have the lovely Debbie Cox DeNova with us again. And of course, she is our transformation coach. Good to see you, Debbie. How are you?
It's good to see you as well. I'm doing great.
Wow, we got a good topic today.
We do.
And a lot of people are going to watch. A lot of people are going to make their loved ones watch. A lot of people are going to make their boyfriends watch and girlfriends watch. And it's called managing anger.
Yeah,
Easier said than done.
absolutely.
Because something trips everybody off. I've learned that in life. There's a trip for everyone, but some people manage it a little better.
Absolutely.
And I'm still, look, I try to manage it every day and try to manage, but you got to, it's a process that can go through life, isn't it?
100%. And
Mm-hmm.
it starts with our relationship to anger because a lot of us have a negative relationship to anger, so much so that we don't allow ourselves. And this is true for if, we're in a dignified position, or sometimes as women, it feels inappropriate for us to express that emotion, which is a very natural emotion, which actually serves a purpose, which we'll talk about several different purposes in our lives. But if we have a negative relationship to it, what we do typically when we have an unhealthy relationship, one of two things happens. Either you become an anger erupter, okay, or an anger stuffer. And neither one is healthy. Anger is said to be like a 4-year-old. You don't want to let the 4-year-old drive the car, but neither do you want to stuff the 4-year-old into the trunk. In both case scenarios, you're going to have a problem on your hands, okay?
Right.
So it's really important for us to understand that anger is a very natural response to to boundaries being disrupted in our lives, standards being violated. Sometimes it helps us to heal trauma. Anger can help notify us to places where we are kind of lying to ourselves and holding things back. And anger can inspire us to action. And so when it's handled properly, that's what happens. All right. So, but if you have a negative relationship to it, it can actually pile on shame and guilt for experiencing it, expressing it in negative ways. And over time, it's going to come out. Either it's going to come out direct or sometimes passive aggressively, depending on your personality and what you're allowing for yourself. So, the first thing to do is to understand the neuropsychology. And this comes from Dr. Dan Siegel, and this is the FIST model. So, if you want to try this at home, just to remember to kind of like hold it in place, go ahead and make a hand where you actually cover up your thumb. Okay, so this is the hand brain model here. Okay, so this would represent the brainstem, which controls all the basic bodily functions. Okay, and then if you lift your fingers up like this would represent the amygdala, which we've talked a lot about. This is the seat of emotion. This is our threat detection center. Okay, so all here in the subcortical part of the brain is where we have reactivity, more reactivity. Then when you close it here, the tops of your fingers represent the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so that's the rational thinking mind. That is the wiser aspect of ourselves. Now, what happens whenever we are triggered in any way is that with lightning speed, we basically have all of our physiological responses are activated through the brainstem, and the amygdala gets triggered. Now, this is what happens when we have amygdala hijacking. So if you ever had an experience where you get angry, and you just fly off the handle. You literally flip your lid, right? What happens here in this model is that we lose contact with the wiser, rational, more part of ourselves. This part sort of takes over, the amygdala hijack. So I want to talk today about not only understanding that this is what's at play, what we're actually wanting to do is take this back down, right? And get your PFC back online. We've talked about a number of strategies there to understand that, but also so that we can actually release and express our anger in a healthy way versus something that is going to be destructive.
PFC, prefrontal cortex.
Prefrontal cortex.
And whatever happened, are you going to bring up? I've always heard everybody say every seminar you go to where people are talking about anger management, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 10.
Yeah, yeah.
Does it work?
For counting? Yes. So what you're doing there is actually activating the prefrontal cortex, which we've talked about before. Remembering again the PFC seesaw from an episode way back, just as a reminder. If you imagine your amygdala on one side of a seesaw and your prefrontal cortex on the other, so seat of emotion, seat of reasoning. Remember that?
Right.
Whenever the amygdala is fired up, the PFC is cooled off. This is hijacking, right? This is taking over. So, and then the opposite is also true. When the PFC is fired up, the amygdala calms down. So counting is one way to get that prefrontal cortex engaged so that your amygdala cools off. So that's really what we want.
You're buying time.
You're buying time, exactly.
Right.
And so you're bringing yourself back online so that you can respond instead of reacting. And so counting is one. naming it, name it to tame it, okay, is what Dan Siegel says. I feel tension in my shoulders.
Right.
I feel angry. I'm feeling triggered right now. All of those things can help bring you back online with the PFC. And if you notice somebody that you're talking to is starting to get angry, you can actually help them in the same way. I see that you're getting angry.
Right.
I see that you're feeling hurt right now. And so doing that helps them, gives them a label as well, so they can come back online, so they can get into a mode where they're in a solution-oriented mode versus reactivity where it's going back and forth and you're firing each other up.
We'll talk more about it in the next segment, but is that why as you get older, you do tend to mellow a little bit? Is that through experience? You just learn, okay, the end result of the blow up is going to be both parties feeling bad. I'll be feeling bad. You'll be feeling bad. But if you go about it a different way, you feel a lot better.
Yeah, I think with age, oftentimes comes wisdom, and we start to understand that the experiences that we're going through are not part of who we are. So we create that space where we understand the cost is really not worth what's happening, and so we're able to create mindfulness in those situations to bring ourselves back before we go all the way down to the rabbit hole.
And we'll talk about counseling too. Some people are scared to death to go to counseling, but it may be what they need.
Absolutely, yes.
So most people who get angry, if you talk to a couple that just got in a big fight or whatever, they're always blaming the other one.
Absolutely, yeah.
They got a self-account, do they?
Absolutely. And you know,
That's a
really,
hard thing to do.
it's a hard thing to do. And in our relationships especially, these are the arenas in which we're playing out our deepest, darkest stuff. But if we know that, if we understand that a lot of times, especially when there's triggering and we are left feeling a certain way, and this is really important to understand, is that oftentimes when we're experiencing anger, it's a secondary emotion. Sometimes it's direct. We're absolutely angry. But a lot of times anger is there to actually cover up a more vulnerable experience that we're having. So we feel hurt, but rather than feeling vulnerable in that hurt, we cover it up with anger, or we feel abandoned or rejected, or we feel dismissed, right? A lot of times anger comes up as a layer on top of that underlying layer, and it feels a little bit less vulnerable to express the anger versus going down to the sadness, to the grief, to the whatever else is underneath there.
You said a key word, dismissed. A lot of people would say that or defiance will tip them off quicker than anything.
Yeah, for sure. Because, and that all stems back to childhood. So abandonment, disrespect, dismissal, defiance, all of that tips back to an originating event where it's basically, it feels like a lowering of your own value. So this is an important thing to remember.
It's a learned behavior.
It's a learned behavior, all of it, all of us, for all of us. And then a lot of times we're just poking at each other's triggers, right? So it's important to understand that when we're talking to somebody and there's a disagreement, that we take our opinion and our perspective and we don't identify with it, because then if someone's attacking the perspective that you have, you're not being triggered thinking that they're attacking who you are as a person. So remembering that opinions and points of view are just that, and actually talking through that, and then also remembering that when you're in a conversation, to avoid ad hominem attacks. So that's when you actually, instead of attacking the point of view that you disagree with, you're actually attacking the person or their motives, and that way you're creating it as a personal thing. So anything we want to do, what we want to do is dial back and try to make sure that we're not allowing the amygdala hijack in ourselves or the other person.
So sort of break up the person with the topic. And if you don't agree with what they're saying, sometimes it don't matter if they have the most aggravating voice or attitude or whatever it is. Go to the topic.
Yeah, and approach it like a scientist, right? To avoid confirmation bias, because that's oftentimes what we
good
do
advice.
is we just assume that my perspective is the right one, yours is wrong, and so now I have to prove that. But if you're approaching it from as a third party, as a scientist, what if they do have a good perspective? Then you can actually come to resolution faster, because now you're not, ego battling with each other, and understanding that the ego, that identity that we have, is always trying to protect itself, is a really valuable thing as well, because then you can feel within yourself when that ego battle, that ego is rising, and the same thing on the other side.
I've seen it in court where two attorneys or alpha.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if they're female, male, or whatever. And I used to cover a lot of news stories in court, and I could remember just guys like Mr. Jim Alcock, just a great attorney, even killed. The other side would try to get him into their realm and say stuff and try to move him. He never moved.
Yeah.
And it diffused everybody.
Absolutely.
Even made the judge relax.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you're talking about that because we've talked a lot about creating this open, big posture, especially when you're in a leadership position. It shows dominance, right? But in fact, if you have a negative relationship with your anger, and you're an anger eruptor where you go into fight mode, right, or you're an anger stuffer, you go into flight or fight, flight or freeze mode, then what you want to do is actually watch your physiology and use your physiology to avoid an amygdala hijack, which means that in this case scenario, you don't want to make yourself bigger. If you look at animals in the wild, they naturally puff themselves up and make themselves larger in an attempt to show dominance in an argument or in a fight. So to scare the other person off. Humans naturally do this as well, but the problem is that when you do that, you're actually heightening the chances that your amygdala hijack will happen if you raise your voice. So if we use our physiology, if we keep our tone lower and we manage the tone of our voice, if we keep our posture, and in this case scenario, slumping is not a bad thing. Like actually just relaxing your body down a little bit so that you're not creating this impression that you are in a fight, then the amygdala cannot have that extra signal of like, oh, something's wrong here. So if you keep your movements small and your posture unassuming, and you keep your tone down and you're not yelling, you're not making yourself bigger, if you're taking deep breaths, so sometimes what's necessary in these cases is opening your mouth and actually taking in, like you would if you were panting, taking in more oxygen with your mouth open, right? And so basically you're doing everything you can with your physiology to say to keep your PFC online, and you're trying to understand the other's perspective so that you can come to resolution. In some case scenarios, you're going to have to remove yourself from the situation because once you go past a certain tipping point, the adrenaline rises and it's in your system for like 18 minutes. It's really tough to come down once you let all of those chemicals go. But
The seesaw analysis is pretty good. If you get off the seesaw when somebody's at the height,
yeah.
they come crashing down.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we want to remember that it's us against the problem and not us against each other, because when it's us against each other, there's no resolution that happens. Often bigger problems actually erupt from that. So then later on, give your anger creative expression. It has a message for you. So journaling that out, or actually by yourself clenching your fist and actually giving it creative expression so that you are acknowledging the value and the validity behind the perspective. That will help you to come back online. Sometimes you can write a letter that you're never going to send to the person to kind of express all that negative energy, and then you can come online and respond intelligently.
That's a great topic, great analogy, and let's see if it helps.
Yes.
All right? All right, thank you, Debbie. We'll be back. Don't go away.